Hello, this is Tyler, and I'm here to talk about coping with inflation and recession. This will be a story of great difficulties, but at the end there's also the promise of some opportunity. So let's now move to what exactly we mean by inflation and recession. Just to give a very simplified take on inflation and recession, you can think of inflation as something which happens when the demands for goods and services are too high. Most typically, that happens when the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve has created too much money and consumers and businesses are spending too much. Sometimes it happens because oil or energy prices are too high. But in general, think of inflation as being a problem of excess demand. Now, recession, in this sense, is the opposite coin of inflation. Very often, recessions come about when there is not enough demand. So if there's not enough demand, businesses will produce less, they might lay off more workers, they will be less interested in extending their economic activities, and the economy enters a downturn. Now, how are inflation and recession related? Well, if inflation is too high and the central bank, the Federal Reserve, tries to limit inflation, very often it moves to a state of affairs where then demand is too low and you end up with recession. So pretty often, not always, but inflations are followed by recessions. Now, a key question: when is the best time to prepare for either inflation or recession? The answer actually is pretty simple. The best time is now. And it doesn't matter exactly when I'm speaking, but the best time is now because inflation, when it arrives, can come pretty suddenly. When inflation in the United States spiked in early 2022, this was not widely expected. All of a sudden, we had inflation of almost 9%. As I'm speaking now in 2023, some economists are suggesting we're due for a recession. No one quite knows for sure, but when the recession comes, a lot of people will be surprised. Now, to consider some costs of inflation. Why is inflation a bad thing? If you look at this picture, you see a pocket calculator, and you can't really read the numbers or the letters properly. They're distorted. You're confused. That's exactly the core problem with inflation. When inflation is going on, individuals, small business owners, everyone, we don't always know how to read economic signals. Sometimes we just see a lot more dollars coming in the door, and we think, hey, this is great. I need to expand my business. But it's not really that your business is doing better. The more dollars are coming in the door just because there's inflation, and that can be bad for your business. So one possibility is you end up expanding your business when you shouldn't, and that makes inflationary environments riskier. It's also the case that your accounting is harder to interpret because you have revenues, you have outflows, and they're defined across different periods of time. How do you make them commensurable? When the rate of inflation is high, your own accounting will confuse you. Another problem has to do with interest rates. Inflation makes interest rates more volatile. So if you're a small business or whatever it is you do in some way depends on interest rates, let's say you're a realtor, interest rates being more volatile, it means your business is riskier and you could get an interest rate call wrong, and the housing sector could be shrinking when you would otherwise be hoping that it is expanding. So overall, when inflation comes along, it's easier to make bad decisions. And furthermore, as I explained a bit earlier, inflation very often is followed by a recession, which is yet another problem. So now, of course, you're all wondering how to cope with inflation. What should we do about inflation? And let me just go through a few bullet points. Here's some things you can do. First, you can diversify product lines. That means start selling some things you weren't selling before, get a fresh start, rethink what you're doing, diversify your risk more, and give yourself some more protection. What would be an advantage? What would be an example of that? Well, take a pet shop that all of a sudden starts selling more pet health and wellness products. Take a rapper who used to just sell music, that's a small business too, but who then starts selling t-shirts and swag and other products. Take someone who runs a music store. It used to sell compact discs, then it moved to long-playing records. Well, there's inflation, consumers might have lower real incomes, so now that store could start selling books or t-shirts. I've seen this several times in the last month traveling around. So think about how can you protect your risk by diversifying product lines. Also, think about creative ways of discounting your product or engaging in price discrimination. Again, keep in mind your customers might be feeling a pinch. They might have, in real terms, less money to spend on your products. So what would be an example? Well, if you are managing a travel property, you might need to be more flexible in your price to get in some groups in a downtime when otherwise demand might not be there. If you're selling a service, let's say you're a dentist, you might need to be more flexible with your billing or when you collect your bills, give more generous credit terms. It's simply the case that as your buyers experience more hardship, you need to be more flexible. A third approach to inflation: seek out new markets, look for new customers, because the old ones may not be as profitable as before. So if you're selling something in one state, consider marketing it in other states as well. A lot of businesses are doing this right now. In the country of Ukraine, there's a farmer I know. He was selling his product, it's organic produce, in Ukraine only. Ukraine now has a war and high inflation, so he's also started selling to Poland. So be creative, look for places you can find new customers. Cost cutting. It may be necessary for you to look at your costs more carefully. We've seen this in its most pronounced fashion with a lot of tech companies, whether they be large or small, and they've simply decided that they're not going to hire at the earlier pace they were hiring. Most generally, number 5, be cautious about your long-term commitments and contracts. There's not really an example of this because it's a case of not doing something rather than doing something. But just think before you commit. And finally, number 6, consider that you might need to raise your prices. A lot of merchants, people with small businesses, they're reluctant to raise prices because they fear it will alienate their consumers. But it may be the case you simply have to. What I've seen happen is a lot of restaurants, there's one Chinese restaurant in particular I know, they've decided to make the bold move of raising prices to a kind of luxury level and just telling their customers, look, we're producing for you excellent Chinese food. We think you're willing to pay these luxury prices. And when I go to that restaurant, actually, it's still quite packed. This strategy has worked for them. Now let's consider how you might cope with recession. Some of these actually are the same strategies that you use to cope with inflation. So finding new product lines, looking for new ways to price discriminate or discount, charge people different prices, looking for new markets. Since inflation is often followed by recession, sometimes the inflation actually prepares you to deal with the recession that is coming. And again, as I've noted, recessions tend to come suddenly, and they're not always announced much in advance. Key principle in recessions is simply avoid debt. Try to keep your net worth high. Debt payments can put a small business out of business very readily. This is just common sense, but it really cannot be stressed enough. Be prepared. But a general point I would note, and here we're turning to the theme of opportunity, recessions, in fact, can be very good times to pick up talent or to start new businesses. If the economy is in a boom and all of the major corporations are paying super high wages, it can be very hard for you to hire people with your small startup, or say you want to expand your small business. Well, everyone else has a job, everyone else is being paid a lot, they're pretty happy. It's very hard to put together a talented team. So just to continue with this theme of opportunity is always present, there are green shoots in a recession. Inflation is painful, a recession is painful. They're not good things to have. I'm not trying to apologize for them, but eventually we do come out of recessions, and in part they come out because people who run small businesses and also large businesses, they look around, they find talented people who are unemployed or underemployed, and they hire them to do something new and creative. So it's just like a setback in your life. It's a bad thing to have, but if it causes you to rethink what you're doing, and again, go back to these key ideas, finding new product lines, coming up with new ways of pricing your product, expanding your markets. Opportunity is indeed present in all economic circumstances. So maybe you're wondering, what's the current state of the union? Well, most economists believe that right now the underlying rate of inflation in the U.S. economy is probably somewhere between 4 and 5%. That's come down from its maximum of 8 to 9%, but typically it's a little below 2%, so it still feels pretty high. The big debate at the moment is, to get down from 4 to 5% back to 2%, will we need to have a recession? On that, economists disagree, and I see opinion as pretty much evenly divided. I'm myself somewhat in the optimistic camp, but we will see. But again, the core point, you need to be ready now for both inflation and recession. Please do not be too discouraged. Try to do your best and turn things around, because indeed, opportunity always is present. Thank you all.